Hello everybody and welcome back to the final Streamline tutorial. Today we're going to be going over something that you've probably been looking forward to, which is how Streamline works with Niagara Fluids. In this tutorial we will be building a kind of fire trail sequence here that you can see. And this is one of the many things you can do using splines and Niagara Fluids, but this asset pack basically makes it possible so that you can use any splines you want and have them interact with Niagara Fluids however you want. There are zero limitations on this, and it's nothing really special. Niagara Fluids is just another way of rendering particles, so Streamline naturally, since it's built with the Niagara particle emitters in mind, works just fine with it. So as you will find, there are many things you can use Streamline for with Niagara Fluids. I'm using it for fire here. However, you can also use it for fluid sims and other gas and cloud related sims. Possibilities are really limitless. But today we are going to be building this kind of a fire trail animation here. Right now it's lower resolution, but we will be building a more higher res rendered sequence so that you can see this rendered out in much more higher resolution in real time. As of right now, it's kind of blocky and blurry. But basically what we'll have is flames traveling up these splines and illuminating this large torch right here. And it's just a simple animation of the fire traveling along the spline. All this really is just tuning a few of the fire components in the emitter to get them to have this animation look like this. And then after that, we will be going over how to actually get the sequencer set up for how to create this. So here in the editor, what I'm going to do, since this is part 7 of the tutorials, you have probably figured out by now how to build out these splines. So I will just be copying these splines directly and then moving them over here. I'm not going to be building these again because there's nothing much to see with it right there. So I am just going to go drag out my Streamline systems. And use these other systems over here as the basis to copy to these. And one thing I will be doing so I can get this rotation accurate, but there is no world space rotation issues, is I will be using 2 systems here so I can kind of copy back and forth and transform off of each other the different systems. So I rotated that system, and then I will be copying it over here so I get a correct system for this one. Then what I can do is I can transform this one here again, mirror it over the Y, so it's like this. Then we have the 2 systems that we need. So I will get these into place. We have this one right there. We might want to raise it up a bit so that the spline is really in the trough right there that I have made for it. To make this little setup, all you really need to do is, you can have this go any direction obviously along here, but you can have your trough, which the fire will fill, and then in this case I used cable actors that the fire will travel up, and then it will ignite this bowl up here. And I don't have a sphere up top, so I'm going to add that real quick. And make sure to scale it up so that these lines traveling around it are more or less sticking out of it. If they intersect into it too far, it can ruin the effect. Move that up a bit more. Move it back a little bit. There we see these lines are. The splines are all around the outside of it and covering it fairly well. That should work just fine. Over here, it is just a bit larger and set further down, so we could also do that too. We could scale it up a bit more and then just set it down further. Okay, and that is our setup complete. The next thing we need to do is actually make our fire system. So to do that, go to our folders here, create a new Niagara system, One important thing to note is that you have the Niagara Fluids plugin enabled for this, since that will provide the necessary content for working with your 2D and 3D fluid simulations. So I will be working off of the Grid 3D gas Fire. And so what this will do is normally it's used to set a mesh on fire, but what I'm going to be using this for is to have the fire travel along a spline instead. So I'm going to go here, use this template, and create this system. We can call it Fire Trail Effects. Wait for it to compile. And that should be good. Let's open it up. And we can see the usual Niagara Fluids setup is already here. So the first thing I'm going to do, since it'll be running slowly with this high definition simulation right here, is I'm going to close my preview so that my GPU doesn't have to worry about rendering out all of that at the same time as I'm working on it. That is something I commonly do when I'm working on higher computational intensity systems, is I will usually close the preview, since something like that is often better seen in its context anyway, and also it lets my system have a bit of a break while I'm working on it, so I'm not getting as much lag in my workspace. Okay, so right off the bat, there's a few things we can do. We can get rid of our shape location sphere and our sample static mesh and other static mesh related modules here. Since we are not working with a static mesh or just a generic shape location, we will be using a spline. So we can get rid of those, and we can add a shape location spline and move that up above curl noise force. And we'll also want to set our bounds here to fixed, since it's a GPU, so this will just help out the GPU a bit. That should be fine for now. And down in spawn rate, since this will be in a fairly large volume, I am going to double my spawn rate here to 100,000. This may or may not run well depending on how beefy of a GPU you have. This is really up to you, but in my opinion, for this effect to look good, I'm going to have at least 100,000 particles in this spawn rate here. So if we go through and check all of this, all of these settings look good. And for our shape location spline, what I will want this to do here is I want a random distribution on the spline so the fire appears to be pretty natural. I will also want to have a radius on the spline of about 7.5-ish so that it can fill the trough that it's in and make it look like that whole thing is really on fire. This can also be a random radius as well. If you want, you can make it random filled, but with the way the fire is rendered, it doesn't make too much of a difference at this scale. And with that, we can check our curl force here. Since, again, we're working on different scales than our traditional with this emitter, we'll need to change these settings. I found that noise strength of 2 and a frequency of 30 just looks pretty good. And then also we can pan the noise field a bit differently as well to get a different effect for this larger scale. Next, we can go down to our density. Our density should already be set up the way we want it. And then same with our color. And this isn't where you define the color for the fire anyway. This is used for other values here. What this does is if you use your debug renderer, you can actually see these particles being spawned, and they will be this white, and then they will fade to black over their life and whatnot. So this is more for debug stuff. If you want red debug particles, then you can switch this on. Otherwise, it's not going to make a big difference. You aren't going to see these particles because these are just fed from this emitter into this emitter as basically physics data for how to perform the simulation. You're not actually seeing these particles here. Our particle state should have the particles die when they're done. We should have a drag of 1. Scale sprite size should kind of have this smooth to sharp curve for its size fall off. And then finally we have the fluid source attributes. If you have this update over here that it's telling you about, you can go ahead and update. It will not make a difference for this emitter here. So I'm going to update this to the 4.0 version of the script, and we can dismiss this message. And then this is just saying this, takes all of this data from these particles and just dumps it into this simulation. So this is a way to set that up easily without having to dig into this absolutely massive emitter here and find all the properties you need to. However, for what we are doing, we will need to worry about a few more settings that are in this large emitter here that you can't just set right here. So for one of them, we will need to set our velocity dissipation to about 0.2 so that the fire can move a bit more, because again, we're shifting the bounds on the scales. We will need to change some of these values around based on that. And also we will want to turn off our mesh collisions, and that will naturally turn off the distance fields. Because if this starts colliding with some of our meshes we have set up, this will actually ruin the effect, because the fire will start colliding, and what the particles will do is they'll actually start to bunch up. And since it's just a heat simulation, you actually start getting these mini mushroom clouds, and that doesn't look at all like fire, so that's something that you will want to avoid in this case. So we'll just use mesh collisions and instead tune our fire very well to its environment instead of relying on collisions to guide the fire in a specific path. And down here is the debug. This is where you can just draw out the grids and the particles and all those things. And this is where you can see these particles being turned on and off. You can also go down here and turn on the sprite renderer and you can see them. I will show you that in a minute. And basically this is just more settings for how to run through all of these simulations things. You can add more turbulence levels here to the fire if you want. Again, you can do more collisions. You can also have wind affect the fire as well if you want wind blowing a particular direction. These are further emitter settings that alter the parameters being passed in from this emitter right here. Also, we can turn down our temperature scale here from our emitter and set this to something like 10 instead of 20, so that way our temperature isn't overblown. And then this does a few other attribute modifications here, again, on some of this stuff, and also a few things that you don't otherwise have the ability to alter through this emitter right here. But all of this should be left as the same. And then you'll notice when we turned off our mesh collisions, we will get this object warning thing. Don't worry about this. This won't actually affect our system, really. It's just saying, hey, our variable here is missing a value. What's going on? But that's just fine since we don't need to worry about that variable's value anyway. So it should not run into any problems because of this warning here. And then this is just all the boundaries for our emitter here. And then again, smoke color, quality overrides. If you want to turn this down so that your computer can handle it at a decent rate, you can turn this down to something lower than cinematic. I will be running it on cinematic though, since I can, so that way I can get a good idea of the final product as I'm making it. And then down here we have more debug rendering things. We can render the density, we can render slices of the simulation, we can render vectors. This is where you actually determine the color of your fire. So if you wanted to come in here and make your fire green, you would go ahead, click on this, and then you could change your color here. And this is just a slider for defining those fire colors, and then also the temperature as well. And that is basically the gas emitter that we were working with, summarized really quickly. But let's get to actually putting this into our world. So first, let's save this emitter here. We can head back. And we haven't attached it to our Streamline systems yet, so let's go and add our fire trail effects. And what we will notice is it's just this little box right now, not really doing anything. So let's go to our emitter, and we will see this is also where we select our mesh that it would normally emit from. Right now we're fine just leaving that as nothing. And so we can turn our draw bounds on here so we can see what we're working with. And this is also where you offset this by some amount within these bounds. And also this is where you turn down your resolution. Over here on these emitters, we are dealing with lower resolution so we can render these well and timely for this. It's still 256, but if you're struggling to run these emitters at 256, you can turn this down. However, be aware that means you will need to change around some of your values so that you can get some decent looking fire. Okay, so if we want to change these bounds here, we can basically shift these numbers around. And this will obviously shift our box. This is a pretty terrible box to have. It's going to take up a lot of resources and not have the spline within it. That's something you'll want to consider when you're making this, is to make sure that your bounds only encompass the spline and where you expect the simulation to go from the spline. You do not want to have this encompass anything that's going to ultimately be just pure empty space and never be used, because then what you're doing is you're wasting resources calculating stuff in this potential empty space with all of the cells it divides it into. And that's just not good for performance, and nobody likes laggy visual effects. So what I'm going to do is, you can, with whatever your setup is, tamper around with your size and also your offset within there to get that however you need it to be. I am going to use the values I already have set up over here, since again, it's just a lot of experimentation. That's nothing fun to watch. So I am going to just use these, and you can figure out how to do it for whatever you have set up. And so what we need to do now is, we have our box at the correct size, but we need to center it around this. So what we can do, we can just take our emitter and we can move the actual emitter center. This isn't moving where the emitter starts or anything, since we're calculating that only from the spline. We're just moving this box of the emitter around our spline, which is the emission source. So we can do this until we get our system covered. Right about there is looking good. We have our spline here at the bottom covered. We might want to actually move this down a little bit so we can get below this trough here. But then we see it works, and we have plenty of space up top too for the fire to be rendered. And now what you will notice is we aren't actually seeing any fire yet. This is probably pretty disappointing, honestly. And so one of the reasons why this isn't showing is because we haven't reset our transforms over here to 0, 0, 0 on rotation and 1, 1, 1 on scale. So I will do that really quick. That is important, because if we're working in world space, then stuff is going to get rotated to other places that we may not necessarily expect. One easy way to fix this is actually to duplicate this system and then sample from this duplicated system onto this one. And since the samples bakes these values back down to the base, we can sample from there, sample that. And then if we just zero this back out, put it back to 1 there, we have the exact same spline here, and we can see it has fire along it now. We can delete this duplicated actor. So, as we can see, we need to move our bounding box into the correct region again. So we can take this, grab our emitter, move it back along the y-axis in this direction. You can see we now have the fire spawning along our entire cable here. And it looks pretty similar to this. This is roughly what we're going for. It may look low resolution right now, but once we get to our sequencing, we can turn up the resolution and render out a much better looking version of this. And again, we can render out as good of a version as we need. This will obviously depend on what your graphics card's capabilities in VRAM are too, though. But what we can do now is we can copy this method for setup over to this emitter as well. So I will also make sure to duplicate it, zero the original one out, and then sample from the one I just duplicated, and get rid of the duplicate. Now I can attach the system to this one. Fire trail effects, but we have a small bounding box. So we can take the bounding box values from our first one and copy it into the second one. Now that we have that copied, let's center it again. And we also probably want to move it down a little bit so we can again get that trough. And that's why that wasn't spawning there. It's because we didn't have it down enough. So it's one important thing to check, is make sure that this gives enough room in this trough for the fire to spawn along. And now, as we can see, we have the fire in both of these systems working. So we don't need these bounding boxes really anymore. So what I'm going to do is turn off drawing the bounds on both of these systems, since we don't need them anymore, so they can be out of the way. So that is step one. We now have integrated Streamline with the Niagara Fluids. Now the next thing we need to do is we notice the fire travels along the spline every so often. It just turns off and travels back down the spline again. This is what we will be sequencing out, is the fire traveling along the spline. So the way we do that is we just use our shape location spline and we just modulate what U position we can spawn it from. So all we need to do is we need to go down to our maximum U and we just need to modulo float. And all we do is every 2 seconds of the age divided by 5, we will want to reset this system. So that way we can get the fire traveling up and it'll stay there for a while, but then it will reset eventually, and it will reset faster than the system currently runs. So it is at a good pace. This is what I've found. You can again change these values to get whatever rate you want this fire repeating itself at. But this way, the spline U will go from 0 up to 1. Once it hits 1, it will wait for a bit, and then it will jump back down to 0, up to 1, wait for a bit. Since 2 is past 1, it's just going to basically truncate that down to 1 again internally with this input, and then once it gets modulated, it will jump back down to 0 and start over. So with this system in place, we can save that. Now if we look, we see the fire travels up our splines and illuminates the torch at the top. So the effect is essentially complete. We just have one last thing that we need to do, which is to actually render this out. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, for the sake of my GPU, I am going to turn off the other fire trails I have going right now so that I can focus my GPU on rendering out these. We're basically going to make a cache and save it inside of a level sequence, so that way we can run a sequence whenever we want that has this stored in it, and it will be at a much higher resolution, so it will look more like fire instead of kind of just blurry orange blobs. Turn off auto activation and then reset, and that will turn off the fire system. We can do the same here. We can turn off auto activate and reset, and it is off. So we can focus on these systems. So what we'll first want to do is we'll want to create a level sequence. This is the level sequence I have made here before. We can open it up. As we can see, we just have the 2 fire trails, and then we take the emitter and we create a cache for it here in the level sequence. One thing I would caution about is scrolling and scrubbing through this too quickly. Your GPU can have a freak out if you do that sometimes. Anyways, the first thing we need to do is let's go to our tutorial folders and go to cinematics, create a level sequence, and we can call this fire trail, and then level sequence. You can do whatever there. So we can open this up, and right now we have nothing. So we want to add tracks, and we want actor to sequencer. We have a lot of actors here. A lot of this is just example actors. You may have more or less, but you know which actors you need to look for. Right now we have not renamed these, so let me go do that real quick so that they don't get lost in all of these actors. So I renamed this to Fire Trail Emitter 1, and I will also select all this so that way I can take it here, rename it, and make that Fire Trail Emitter 2. With that done, let's open our level sequence back up, actor to sequencer, and then it should be down here in F. We have Fire Trail Emitter 1 and 2. Let's get those both in there. So now that these are in there, what we need to do is we need to add a emitter component so we can get this emitter and create a cache from what it outputs. We can do that for both. And next what we will do is we will go down and get a Niagara Cache. And what we will see is we will see this recording button appear there. And so this is what we'll do. When we play this sequence with this on, it will record what the system does essentially into a cache. And then it can be replayed over and over as long as you use this sequence for it. Let's also add that here, add a Niagara Cache to Fire Trail Emitter 2. Save a sequencer. Your sequencer may not look like this, especially if you're using an older version of Unreal that Streamline supports, like some version of Unreal Engine 4 or early versions of Unreal Engine 5. It will not look like this. Sequencer recently got a makeover in some of the latest Unreal updates, so it looks better here. And also one thing to keep in mind is if you're using this in the earlier versions of Niagara for Unreal Engine, you won't necessarily have all of these tools at your disposal for Niagara or Niagara Fluids. This is simply a bonus ability of this asset pack that works with the Niagara Fluids, but ultimately this was designed around just Niagara in general. So it'll still work just fine. You just may not have as much Niagara Fluid compatibility depending on how early your version is, simply because there is not as much Niagara Fluid availability at all in earlier versions. And another thing we'll want to add is we'll want to add our life cycle here, and we'll want to set this to desired age. And this will make sure that our age is set properly when we play this through, and it's not jumping around in ways that we wouldn't like it to. Now at this setup, what we'll want to do is, first of all, save our sequencer. When we go back here, we will notice, first of all, the lighting needs to be rebuilt. That is just a bug that occurred because my GPU overloaded while I was working with higher res versions of this, so I'm just going to turn off that. Right. We don't need to worry about that. But we'll notice that our fire trail is not running anymore, and that is because we have it hooked up to this level sequence, and it is not actually on, because even though we have it set to run, it's currently at a 0 state. What I will do is I will take the sequencer, I will move it over to here. I'll move it over. These two recording buttons are the individual tracks that we'll want to record. We can squeeze this down. And what I will do is we can add this right here as a recording band. So we can see this system right there. As we play, the fire, as we can see, is going along and igniting. And that is why you need to be careful with scrubbing. I just exhausted my video memory because of excessive scrubbing. It's loading and loading and loading really, really quickly. And so that caused a big old lag burst right there. So we can avoid that if we just jump back to the beginning here. I'm going to extend this outward a bit more so I can have more control of this. Set that back to 0. So our cache is cached right now. It's only just a 150 frame thing. You can change this however you need for whatever you need to cache it for. But what I'm going to do now is I am going to change these to higher quality settings so that we can go ahead and cache this as a higher quality render. So it will look better if we use the level sequence to show it. So I am going to go to my Fire Trail Emitter 1 and go to the emitter and turn up its resolution by a factor of 2. That's 512 now. So we scrub over to there. We can see it has a bit more resolution to the fire. Again, feel free to turn this up as much as you want. This is all up to you. This is between you and your GPU, really. So we can do 512 for both emitters. As you can see, I am noticing a significant performance drop already in just rendering out twice the number of cells. Well, actually, it's twice the resolution max axis of cells. That's not directly twice the number of cells, that's even more. Since we're dealing in three-dimensional objects, that is going to be approximately about 8 times the cells, just simply due to dimensionality. There's a lot of math behind how that works in different dimensions and how much scaling up one axis with relation to everything else will scale something up. But basically, if you think about it, if you scale down a cube by a factor of 2, so if you make a cube half its size, it takes 8 of those cubes to remake the original cube. And so that's why, in this case, me doubling this axis means I actually just roughly scaled the amount of cells I'm dealing with by 8. So that's why you need to be careful, because this exponentially increases your calculations as you scale that up. But as you can see, we are getting some good effects here. We are getting some fire spawning along the spline. You can also see that radius coming into effect there. But we can move this tag around and we'll notice you're definitely getting some lag here. Move that to frame 0. And so what I will do now is we have our settings for this fire enabled. So if we went to this frame here, we can also just get a freeze frame into the future, see how our fire looks. As we can see, that's looking much better than our original blobs. It's still a little fuzzy, but again, I need my GPU to work after I'm done recording this video. So I'm keeping it at a reasonable level, but something that still looks pretty good, especially if you're viewing this from a distance. Like if this was some distant effect in some temple or something, and you have whatever character the player is operating enter the temple, and it has these trails of fire go along the temple into the distance and ignite the torches along the way, something like that. You don't need super, super high res for that. You can leave it at something about like 512, and in the distance, it will look just fine, as you can see there. And so it also kind of catches this cord on fire and will travel up there. So it's not actually cached right now. It's still just rendering it out frame by frame. So what we can do is bring that back to frame 0. And we can refresh the cache here. And we will see it's recording the sequencer cache. And this is only the sim cache for this upper one. We will do it again for the second emitter. We can see over here it's playing out this in slow-mo as it captures all of these frames. And it has hit the end of the sequence, and it has recorded the sim there. We can set that back to 0. We can record the sim cache for the second one. And it's running faster because it already has this cache for this first one here, so it only has to worry about calculating the second one. And already this is a massive performance improvement. And it is finished caching both of those. So what we can do now is we can move our sequencer over to the side of the screen. And we can see we have very detailed fire, fairly detailed fire, I should say, along this section here. Not super detailed, but it's more than enough for the purposes that I need. So we can set this to 0. Again, you can script through this. I would warn against it, though, if you don't want your GPU to have a freak out. So we can hit play here, and we'll see this is performing really nicely now, and we have a very good fire effect. It may not be exactly real time, but more often if you're looking for high quality fluid effects, you most likely do not need to render it in real time. You're probably fine pre-rendering it into a cache. Like, for example, a distant explosion or something colliding into a building. If you have a sequence that's scripted out, you're probably fine caching all of the fluid sims necessary for that sequence because it's already scripted out. You know it's going to happen, and you can fine-tune these fluid simulations specifically for that, so that way you can get a really precise output and something that looks good and not sacrifice your frame rate. So that is why the sim cache for Niagara is super helpful, is you can get really high quality simulations out of it at very little cost once they are rendered. So now that I have that cache saved, what I can do is I can save this, close it. We'll see it's running in real time now since I have the sequencer closed and we're not worrying about it. So what I will do is I will go back to these emitters and I will turn down their resolution for their cells, And that way I can get my performance back, but whenever I want to have that high quality simulation again, I can just go back to the sim cache and play it over, and then I get my higher quality fire at basically the same performance. And now what this fire is doing here internally, if you want to take a look, you can go here to your particle source emitter, you can check sprite renderer. This will incur a bit of a frame hitch sometimes, depending on, again, your emitter. But as we can see, we have these particles here. This is what the fire simulation is actually being calculated off of, is these particles here traveling up these splines, all of this black and white particles. And so what these are doing is these are providing the data that influences these flames. As you can see, they're bunched closer together when it starts, and that basically equates to more heat. And then once they are up here and fully spread out, it's a bit more spread out, and it means it's kind of down to a lesser heat level. So that is something we will want to consider when making these simulations, is if you have something like this, especially fire, where it's bunched up at first and then it expands outward, if it has a lot of expanding to do, you may want to consider modulating the spawn rate over time so that you don't end up with, in this case, too much heat in one particular area, and that way you prevent an explosive amount of fire in one section. Well, that concludes this final Streamline tutorial on how to use Streamline with Niagara Fluids. And Streamline is basically an asset pack with limitless possibilities with anything Niagara related. You can, again, use it for basic Niagara. You can use it for, as you saw, fluid systems here. This can be fire, water, gases, really anything. And Streamline also has internal compatibility with some of its own built-in functions, so you can make even more scratchpad modules using Streamline to speed up your workflow with those. Overall, Streamline is an incredibly versatile system, and it allows you to create many spline-based particle systems really quickly and streamline the workflow for these Niagara systems. As you saw, we built a Streamline Niagara Fluid system here really quickly, and it looks very good, especially if you use the level sequence that we made for it. Hope this shows you just how much you can do with Streamline. But with that, I want to thank you for watching through this whole tutorial series here on Streamline. If you missed any videos, you can go and check here on our YouTube channel or in the playlist to catch up on something you may have missed. With that, I hope you learned something from this video. If you found this video helpful or informative, don't forget to leave a like so you can help other people find the video. And don't forget to subscribe to Galacticc Games for any more updates or information from us. And also, go ahead and check out our Discord community to engage with others using products such as Streamline to create systems such as these. I hope you enjoyed the Streamline tutorial series, followed along and made some amazing Niagara systems using Streamline. And I hope that you can take your Streamline knowledge even further to create more amazing Niagara systems.